The cold did not announce itself with a howl or a roar, or any of the dramatic declarations that winter usually reserved for open country. It arrived instead with a click, a single clean mechanical sound, the iron latch of a heavy oak door dropping into its bracket, and in that fraction of a second, 4 lives were rearranged permanently. The sound carried no malice on its own. Latches were designed to do exactly this, to hold things shut, to divide one space from another. But the meaning riding inside that particular click on that particular evening, in the wet but bitter gasp of October 1873, was something closer to a sentence being handed down from a bench. Irrevocable. Final. The kind of sound that a person might carry in the hollow of their chest for the rest of their life, surfacing at odd moments in the middle of the night, or in the sudden quiet after a grandchild's laughter fades a splinter that the body never fully absorbs. Agnes heard it and did not flinch. She was 60 years old, and she had learned through a lifetime of absorbing losses both small and catastrophic that flinching was a luxury that consumed energy she could not afford. She stood on the packed earth stoop with her daughter Helen pressed close to her left side, and her 2 grandchildren, Clara and Finn, wedged between the bodies of the 2 women like animals seeking warmth, which was precisely what they were doing. The temperature had been falling steadily since midday. Agnes could feel it in the joints of her hands, that deep, aching cold that worked its way through skin and muscle and settled into the bone itself, announcing its intention to stay. The sky above the western tree line was the color of a bruised purple and gray fading fast to black, and the last weak remnant of October's sun was dissolving behind the jagged silhouette of the hills, as though it too wanted no part of what was happening on this stoop. Through the single pane of wavy, hand-blown glass that served as the cabin's only window, Agnes could see the interior that was no longer hers. The fire in the hearth was burning well. Someone had laid it properly, split hickory stacked in a tight cross pattern, catching fully, now sending a deep amber light washing across the wooden floor, and the rough plank table, and the 3-legged stool where she had sat for the better part of 20 years and done her mending. The smell of venison stew was barely detectable from outside, just the faintest suggestion of it on the air. But Agnes knew that smell as well as she knew her own name, and the recognition of it now filtered through cold glass and the unbridgeable distance of a locked door produced something low and sharp in her stomach that she refused to identify as grief. There was no time for grief. Grief was expensive and slow, and she could see from the angle of the light that they had perhaps 40 minutes of usable dusk left to them. The man standing on the other side of that glass, visible now as a dark silhouette, moving away from the window toward the fire, his broad back turned the gesture of dismissal, so complete it required no accompanying words, was Marcus. Her late husband Thomas had loved his brother in the particular way that men of that generation loved difficult things, with patience, with accommodation, with a carefully maintained silence around the subject of his many failings. Thomas had been dead 4 years. A fever had taken him in the spring of 1869, moving through him with brutal efficiency over the course of 9 days of leaving Agnes a widow with a cabin, a small plot of ground, and a rapidly clarifying understanding of exactly how much of her security in that community had been tied to Thomas's living body, rather than to anything she had built on her own terms. Marcus had stepped into the administrative vacuum that Thomas's death created with the quiet confidence of a man who had been waiting for precisely this opportunity. He had never been cruel in any obvious way. There had been no shouting, no public humiliation, no dramatic confrontation. Marcus operated through inference and omission, through the careful cultivation of other people's anxieties, through a kind of social arithmetic in which Agnes, and then later Helen, were consistently entered on the wrong side of the ledger. He spoke at council meetings about the necessity of hard decisions in lean times. He mentioned in passing, and always to the right people, that a household of women and children placed unusual demands on a community's shared resources. He was the sort of man who could ruin a person's standing in a community without ever raising his voice above the conversational register, and he had done so with a thoroughness that Agnes could not help but acknowledge even now, even standing on this freezing stoop, with the remnants of their life reduced to what fit in a rough burlap sack, was a kind of terrible competence. He had come to the door himself, which she had not expected. She had imagined on the few occasions she had allowed herself to imagine this moment, because she had understood for at least 6 months that this moment was approaching, that the eviction would be delivered by a proxy some younger man sent with an official expression and an averted gaze. Instead, Marcus had opened the door himself, and he had looked at her with something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite regret, and landed somewhere in the strange territory between the two, and he had told her what the council had decided in the same tone a man might use to discuss the price of corn at the general store. A hard winter is coming. Scarcity is a hard master. The four of you draw more than you provide. He had pushed the burlap sack into her hands without ceremony. Agnes had felt the weight of it pitifully light and had understood immediately with the practical intelligence that had been her dominant mode of processing the world for 6 decades, that what she held represented approximately 3 days of careful eating for 4 people. She had not begged. She had not argued. Argument required an audience willing to be persuaded, and Marcus had long since arranged the community's sympathies in the direction that suited him. The other families, the Harpers and the Wentworths and the Sullivans people, she had known for 20 years, people whose children she had helped birth and whose sick she had sat with through long nights, had stopped meeting her eyes at the general store weeks ago. That particular withdrawal, that collective turning away, had been the sharpest thing. Sharper than Marcus's dry, efficient words. Sharper than the locked door. She had already mourned the community. Standing on the stoop now, she found she had nothing left to spend on it. Helen had not been as prepared. Agnes could hear her daughters breathing shallow and fast, the specific rhythm of a person fighting to contain something large. And she did not look at her. Not yet. Helen was 32 years old and had endured her own substantial portion of grief in recent years. Her husband, a good man named Robert with patient hands and an honest laugh, had been killed 2 years ago when a logging chain snapped during a timber operation on the ridge above the settlement. He had not died immediately, which had made it worse. He had lived 3 days in a state of diminishing consciousness while Helen sat beside him and held his hand and watched the light go out of him by degrees, and by the time he was gone, something had gone out of Helen too, something bright and unguarded that had been the most recognizable part of her since childhood. She had come back to Agnes's cabin with Clara and Finn and had rebuilt herself slowly, quietly around the daily routines of motherhood and the small satisfactions of the kitchen garden. She had been getting stronger. Agnes had watched it happen with a kind of fierce, private relief. And now this. Clara was 10 and understood more than Agnes wished she did. The child had her grandmother's eyes, not the color which was Helen's soft brown, but the quality of them, the way they absorbed a situation without editorial comment and processed it into something actionable. She had both arms wrapped around her mother's waist, her face pressed into the rough wool of Helen's skirt, and she was not crying, which told Agnes more than tears would have. Finn was 8 and had always been the more transparent of the 2 children, his interior life visible on his face the way weather is visible in an open field, no cover, no concealment, just the plain fact of what was happening. He was staring at the locked door with an expression that Agnes recognized from her own mirror, the look of a person learning for the first time that the world is capable of a particular kind of specific personal cruelty that they had not previously thought it capable of. He was clutching a small, smooth stone in his right hand, a creek stone he had been carrying for weeks, its surface worn to a perfect oval by years of water. It was the only thing he had grabbed. Agnes made a note of this, not with judgment, but with the particular quality of attention she gave to everything, cataloging it, filing it, understanding that even a child's instinct to grab a smooth stone rather than a blanket or a piece of food told you something true about the human relationship with beauty in the face of catastrophe. She looked away from the window, away from the fire that was no longer hers, away from Marcus's retreating silhouette, away from the amber warmth that she could almost feel through the glass in the wood and the locked iron latch. She looked instead at the horizon, at the last bruised light above the western hills, at the tree line that marked the boundary between the settlement and the vast, indifferent wilderness that began on the other side of it. That wilderness did not know her name. It did not know about Thomas's fever, or Robert's logging chain, or Marcus's council decisions. It was simply there, enormous, and cold, and complete in its own terms, and it did not care in the slightest whether 4 people lived or died within it. This was, Agnes decided, a kind of honesty she could work with. She adjusted the thin shawl across her shoulders. She picked up the burlap sack. It was lighter than a sack of flour, lighter than a bundle of mending, lighter than almost anything she had ever been asked to carry, and yet it was the heaviest thing she had held in 4 years. She said, "Come." Her voice came out steady. She had not been certain it would. There was no performance in the steadiness. It was simply the sound of a woman who had made a decision, who had taken the single step that divides paralysis from motion, and whose body had organized itself accordingly. Helen pushed away from the wall. Clara unwound her arms from her mother's waist and took her hand instead. Finn turned from the locked door finally and fell into step beside his grandmother, still holding the stone. They walked away from the cabin without looking back. Agnes had learned from an early age that looking back at things you cannot change is a way of spending yourself on a transaction that offers no return. The packed earth path, the woodpile stacked against the east wall of the cabin, the small fenced kitchen garden where Helen had grown beans and squash in 3 rows of late-season greens, she noted all of it in her peripheral vision and filed it and kept walking. The path turned north at the edge of the cabin's cleared ground and then dissolved into the rougher terrain beyond where the grass was frost-brittle and the soil had already begun its long winter hardening. The trees closed around them within 100 yards. The first night was the worst because it contained in compressed form everything that the coming weeks might become. Agnes found a shallow rock overhang on the eastern face of a low limestone outcropping, a scoop of stone that offered perhaps 4 feet of depth, and not much more than that in terms of protection from the wind, which was coming from the northwest and finding every gap in their clothing with a cold surgical precision. She built a fire using the flint and steel she had kept in her apron pocket, kept there for years as a matter of habit, one of those small, practical disciplines that had never seemed important enough to mention, and now seemed like the most important thing in the world. The fire was hesitant at first, feeding on dry leaves and finger-thin twigs, uncertain of itself in the wind. Agnes sheltered it with her body, feeding it, slowly building it up with patient incrementalism, from spark to flame to something that could be called reliable. They ate the bacon. Agnes sliced it thinner than she would have for a normal meal, thin enough that each piece was almost translucent at the edges, and laid it on a flat stone she had angled at the fire's edge. The sizzle of it in the cold air was an almost unbearable sound, saturated with the ghost of normalcy of kitchens and cast iron and ordinary evenings. She divided the portions with exactness. She did not give herself more. She did not give the children less, though she calculated briefly and then abandoned the calculation because certain kinds of accounting were a form of despair, and despair was the one luxury she could afford even less than grief. They ate without speaking. The firelight moved across their faces, 4 faces each, wearing a different version of the same understanding. Helen's eyes held a brightness that was not warmth. Clara ate carefully, mechanically chewing as though eating were a duty rather than a comfort. Finn ate quickly, the way hungry children eat, and then stared into the flames with the stone still in his hand. When the food was gone and the children had curled together under the one thin blanket they had been allowed to keep, Helen leaned close to Agnes and spoke quietly, her voice stripped of everything except the raw material of the question. "What will we do, Mama?" Agnes stared into the fire. She let the question sit for a moment, not because she was avoiding it, but because she was already answering it in the way she answered most important questions, not from the top of her mind, where panic and immediacy lived, but from somewhere deeper and quieter, the place where 60 years of observation had accumulated into something that was more than knowledge and not quite wisdom, and might most accurately be described as a kind of native fluency with the real world. She was taking inventory, not of what they had lost, that accounting was closed, but of what they still possessed. The reckoning was swift and honest. One axe, its hickory handle worn smooth by her husband's hands and then her own. One good iron shovel with a hairline crack in the blade that had been there for 3 years and had not worsened. A knife with a 6-inch blade kept sharp. A small cloth bag of salt, perhaps 2 pounds, folded closed at the top. The blanket already serving the children. The clothes on their backs, 2 women and 2 children in late October clothing adequate for a cold day, not adequate for sustained exposure. The burlap sack with what remained of the food. And one more thing that did not fit on a physical inventory list, the accumulated library of her own attention, 60 years of watching how the world actually worked in this particular corner of it. The frost patterns and the game trails and the timber species and the water sources and the behavioral logic of every creature she had ever shared this landscape with. Marcus had taken the cabin. He had taken the workshop and the tools and the kitchen garden and the community's goodwill and the 20 years of small social credit that Agnes had built up through reliable behavior and useful labor. He had taken in one dry, efficient speech at a council meeting. Agnes had not been invited to attend almost everything that could be named and inventoried. But he could not take what she carried inside her own mind. That was hers in the most fundamental sense possible, more hers than the cabin had ever been. And as she sat by the small fire in the growing dark and let the inventory complete itself, she felt something clarify in her chest. Not hope exactly. Hope was too light a word for what it was, more like the sensation of ground under the feet after a period of swimming. Something solid, something to push against. She told Helen, "We endure the night. Tomorrow we will find a better place. We will build." Helen turned to look at her. Even in the firelight, Agnes could see the edges of disbelief working in her daughter's expression. Not disbelief in Agnes specifically, but the broader, more fundamental disbelief of a person whose understanding of what is possible has just been severely tested. Build what? Helen's voice was quiet, scraped clean. With what? Agnes did not have the full architecture of the answer yet. She had the word, and she held it the way a person holds a tool they have not yet determined the use for by the weight and the balance of it, by the confidence that something shaped this purposefully was made for a reason. She simply said it again quietly. We will build, and let the word do the work that explanations could not do at that hour on that night with that fire. Helen was quiet for a long time. Then she pulled her knees to her chest and watched the fire, and Agnes watched her, and eventually both women let the exhaustion of the day take them somewhere past conversation. The days that followed were a particular kind of suffering, not dramatic, not acute, but steady and cumulative, the way a slow leak empties a vessel more completely than a sudden fracture. They stretched the 3 days of rations to 5 through a discipline that required constant low-grade negotiation with the body's most fundamental instincts. Portions became smaller by the day. The bacon was gone by day 3. The brown bread eaten in fingertip-sized pieces lasted another day. The cornmeal boiled with creek water over the fire each evening into a thin, pale mush that provided calories without anything resembling satisfaction was all they had by day 5, and by the end of it, the pot was scraped clean, and there was nothing left from what Marcus had provided. They moved. This was Agnes's first and most persistent directive to herself: keep moving, keep going upstream, keep the creek on the left and the higher ground ahead. The logic was simple. The settlement was behind them and to the south, and anything that might resemble viable territory for the kind of long-term shelter she was beginning to envision would be found in the less traveled country further into the hills. She navigated by the creek and by the angle of the morning light and by the patterns of the trees, reading the landscape the way a literate person reads a page, finding information in the species composition of the forest and the moisture content of the soil and the height of the creek banks and the direction of deer sign in the undergrowth. The rock overhang on the first night had been a crisis solution. It was too exposed. The wind came around the limestone outcropping from both sides in the early morning hours and stripped the fire's warmth away with efficient thoroughness. By the second night, they had moved to a denser stand of pine, where the canopy reduced the wind to something manageable, and the needle duff on the ground provided a thin layer of insulation. By the third night, Agnes had identified a concavity in the hillside, not a cave, not really just a place where the rock had eroded back into the slope, and the overhanging shelf above it was thick enough to deflect rain, and they had made that their temporary base. Temporary was the operative word. Agnes knew that what they had was survivable in the short term and fatal in the long term. The difference between those two conditions was not a matter of a few degrees either way in the weather. It was a matter of systems, a place where a fire's heat could be captured and held, a way to preserve food across the weeks between a successful hunt and the next one, a structure that could be sealed against wind and wet in the deep cold that would arrive, she knew from long experience, before the end of November, and would not release its grip until March at the earliest. On the 5th day, she snared a rabbit. It was a small thing, a young cottontail, that had not had time to put on the deeper reserves that a mature rabbit carried into winter, and there was not enough of it to fill 4 stomachs. But Agnes made a broth from the bones that gave the children something warm to swallow and extracted every possible calorie from the carcass with the patient thoroughness of someone who understands that waste is a form of violence against the future. Clara and Finn ate without complaint. They had both, Agnes noticed, grown quieter since the first night, not sullen, not withdrawn in any worrying way, but quieter in the way that children get quiet when the world reveals itself to be a more serious place than they had previously understood. It was not a quality she wanted to encourage in them if she had a choice. But she did not currently have a choice. Finn's cough started on the sixth morning. It came without warning. He woke from sleep with a dry, barking sound that opened Agnes's eyes immediately and sent her hand to his forehead before she was fully conscious. No fever, not yet. But the cough was the kind that settled into the chest and sent roots downward, and Agnes had attended enough sick children in her lifetime to understand the vocabulary it spoke. Cold air, inadequate shelter, a body running on insufficient fuel. The equation was not complicated, and its solution was not in doubt. They needed better protection, and they needed it within days, not weeks. This was the truth that organized everything that came after. Not the eviction, not Marcus's careful cruelty, not the ice that was beginning to form at the creek's edges by morning and melting back by afternoon. The retreat that told Agnes with the authority of 40 winters observed that they were perhaps 3 weeks from the moment when that ice would stop retreating. No. The thing that focused her with absolute clarity, that distilled all the ambient danger of their situation into a single legible imperative, was the sound of Finn's cough in the cold morning air. She lay on the ground beside him for a moment, after checking his temperature, listening to the sound of it, and something in her chest locked into a new configuration. She had been resourceful before this moment. After it, she was something beyond resourceful, something closer to implacable. She told Helen she was scouting. Helen's expression contained a question she did not ask, and Agnes answered it preemptively. Watch the fire, keep him warm. Then she took the axe, not because she needed it for scouting, but because walking unarmed in this country was a form of carelessness she was no longer willing to practice, and she went further up the ridge than she had gone before. The climb was steep, and her legs registered their objections. She was 60 years old and had been eating inadequately for almost a week, and there was a specific quality to the fatigue that came from that combination. Not the clean tiredness of hard work on a full stomach, but something heavier and more hollow, an exhaustion that had no real bottom to it. She ignored it. She climbed by, putting one foot in front of the other and keeping her eyes on the angle of the ridge above her, and when her lungs protested, she slowed her pace but did not stop. And eventually the slope eased, and she came out onto a stretch of rocky open ground near the top of the ridge where the trees thinned and the view opened up to the south and west. She stood still for a long moment. Not resting, she would rest at the bottom when there was a reason to rest. She was reading. The landscape below her was a study in grays and browns, the color of late October stripped of its brief autumnal drama. The trees, mostly bare now, their branch structures visible against the sky like the dendritic patterns of river systems seen from above. The creek was a silver line threading the valley floor, finding its way between the hills, with the patient, unhurried logic of water seeking its own level. She could see the smoke of the settlement, faint and distant, rising from the south, a reminder that the world they had been expelled from was not far away in physical terms, only in every other sense. She noted it and looked away from it. Her attention moved systematically across the terrain the way it always moved, not jumping but scanning, picking up information in the same order. She always used water first, then elevation, then species composition of the vegetation, then the signs of animal use, then the specific geological features. It was a methodology she had developed over decades without ever giving it a name, an internalized protocol for extracting the maximum amount of useful information from a given landscape in a given period of time. She almost missed it. It was not remarkable in any obvious way, a smooth, rounded hill on the opposite side of the creek, perhaps a quarter-mile to the north, sitting lower than the ridge she was standing on, but higher than the valley floor. Dozens of hills in this country looked like it, but Agnes looked at it longer than she looked at the others, and as she looked, the thing that had almost escaped her came into focus. The north-facing side of that hill was steeper than the south-facing side. The differential was not dramatic, perhaps 20 degrees of additional pitch, but it was consistent, and the vegetation on that face was different from the surrounding woodland in a way that told a specific story. Mostly pine here and there, an oak that had held its dead leaves well into the season, the whole composition suggesting a slope that received less direct sun, that stayed colder longer, that shed its frost more slowly in the morning. The earth there would be different from the earth on the sunny side, colder at depth, more stable in temperature throughout the day and across the seasons. Agnes stood on the ridge and looked at that hill for a long time. She was not thinking about shelter exactly, or not only about shelter. She was thinking about something older and more specific, a thing that lived in the back of her mind as a memory, rather than a plan surfacing now, with the particular insistence of something that has been waiting for its moment. Her grandfather, her mother's father, a man from the eastern part of the country, who had carried his knowledge of the land with him the way people carry essential tools, had dug into the north-facing slope of a hill on his property when Agnes was a young girl. She had watched him do it over the course of a summer, a methodical, patient excavation that had seemed to her childhood eyes like an inexplicable eccentricity. He had lined the resulting chamber with stone and fitted it with a heavy wooden door and stored his root vegetables in it through the winter, and they had come out in April still firm and sweet and alive in a way that the vegetables stored in above-ground cellars never quite managed. He had tried to explain it to her once, standing in the cool dark of the finished chamber, with his lantern casting yellow light across the smooth stone walls. The earth holds cold the way a stone holds heat, he had told her. Constant, patient. It doesn't chase the temperature above. It remembers where it was and stays there. She had been perhaps 8 years old, young enough to absorb the information without yet having the context to apply it. For more than 50 years, that memory had lived in the back of her mind as a piece of inherited knowledge waiting for use. Standing on this ridge now, looking at that north-facing hill across the creek, she felt its surface with a kind of urgency that was almost physical, a pressure at the base of her skull that resolved into clarity as she focused on it. But it was a second memory that completed the equation, and this one arrived harder and faster, colliding with the first, the way two currents collide in moving water. A neighbor years ago, a man named Patterson, who had decided to try smoking fish after a good creek season, had done it badly using a converted barrel positioned directly over his fire pit. Agnes had seen the results: fish that was overcooked on the outside and still uncertain in the center, desiccated and bitter and gray at the edges from the proximity to the heat. Patterson had complained for weeks about the failure. The smoke was too hot, he said. The fire too close. The fish had cooked before it could cure. The two memories found each other somewhere in the architecture of Agnes's thinking, and what they produced together was not simply a synthesis, but a revelation, a complete system materializing in her mind with the specific, startling clarity of something that has always been true and has simply been waiting to be articulated. A chamber dug into the cold north face of a hill shielded by the Earth's own thermal consistency. A fire built away from it, not directly under it, not adjacent to it, but at a distance lower on the slope. A passage connecting them through the Earth itself, a stone-lined tunnel long enough that by the time the smoke traveled its length, it would have surrendered its heat to the surrounding clay and arrive in the chamber cool, carrying only its chemical properties, the acids and compounds that prevented bacterial growth, that darkened and firmed the surface of the meat, that could turn a raw cut of venison into something that would remain edible for weeks without any additional intervention. Not hot smoke, cold smoke. Not a cooking method, a preservation system. Not a barrel over a fire. A machine made of earth and stone, using the consistent cold of the north-facing hillside as its operating principle, requiring no fuel except the modest ongoing fire in the distant pit, capable of turning a single lucky hunt into a winter's worth of food. Agnes stood on the ridge for another full minute after the idea had finished assembling itself, which was longer than she usually spent in stationary contemplation. She was checking it, running it against everything she knew about heat transfer and cold retention and the chemistry of smoke, against the evidence of her grandfather's root cellar and Patterson's failed barrel and every other piece of relevant information she had accumulated in 60 years of paying attention to how the physical world actually behaved. She found no fault in it. The principle was sound. The execution would be brutal. She was not pretending otherwise, but the principle was sound. She turned and began picking her way back down the ridge. The fatigue in her legs was still there, still registering its honest objections. She felt it and acknowledged it and moved anyway because the world below this ridge contained her daughter and her grandchildren, and a cough she was not willing to let develop roots, and because the hill across the creek was not going to dig itself, and because there was at the core of her, underneath the hunger and the cold and the indignity of what had been done to them, and the accumulated weight of the past 6 days, something that had not been there on the stoop outside the locked cabin door. Something that organized the fatigue rather than being defeated by it. The electric focused energy of a person who has identified a solution and understood with complete clarity what it will cost to implement it and decided in the same instant that the cost is acceptable. She came down through the pines and crossed the creek on stepping stones. The water was shockingly cold around her ankles where she misjudged the last stone and stepped into 6 inches of current and climbed the low bank on the far side and came back into the small, smoke-scented circle of their camp, where Helen was feeding the fire with deliberate, careful pieces of dry wood, and Finn was sleeping against his sister's shoulder, and Clara was watching the tree line with her grandmother's eyes. Helen looked up. She had learned across 32 years of being Agnes's daughter to read the quality of her mother's silences and the specific language of her posture, and what she read now produced an expression that was 1 part bewilderment and 2 parts something closer to relief, not because the situation had improved in any measurable way, but because that particular look on Agnes's face meant that Agnes had an idea, and Agnes's ideas in the long history of their family had a rate of effectiveness that Helen had come to trust in the involuntary bone-deep way one trusts the direction of gravity. Agnes crossed to the fire and crouched beside it, warming her wet foot, and looked at her daughter. She let the silence sit for one more moment, not for dramatic effect, but because she was still finishing the internal engineering review, still testing the load-bearing concepts of the plan she was about to describe. Then she picked up a stick from the edge of the fire circle, leaned forward, and began to draw in the dirt. The drawing was crude. She was not an artist, and she was working by firelight in the fading end of an October afternoon. And what emerged on the cold ground was closer to a diagram than a picture: 2 rough circles connected by a line, the hill represented by a curve above the larger circle, the slope indicated by a diagonal scratch. But as Agnes drew and spoke in a low, steady voice, explaining each element, working through the logic of the flue and the cold smoke principle and the Earth's thermal properties, she watched something happen in her daughter's face that was worth more to her in that moment than almost any other thing she could have asked for. The disbelief did not disappear. It would take more than a drawing in the dirt to accomplish that. But behind the disbelief, small and tentative, and real as a coal newly caught, there was a flicker of something else. The recognition in Helen's eyes that this was not desperation talking, that the logic held, that the 2 circles connected by a line in the dirt represented not a fantasy, but an actual plan, specific, executable, grounded in observable principles that she could trace with her own understanding. It was the first light either of them had seen in 6 days. Above them, the October sky had gone fully dark. The fire popped and sent a spray of orange sparks upward into the cold air, and Finn stirred against his sister's shoulder without waking, and the cough did not come. And for one brief suspended moment, the 4 of them occupied their small circle of warmth in the enormous dark without speaking. Agnes looked at the drawing she had made in the dirt, the 2 circles in the connecting line. Simple as a child's diagram, radical as anything she had ever conceived. She looked at it for a long time, the way a person looks at a door that has just appeared in a wall that was moments before solid and windowless and without apparent exit. Real survival, she had learned over 60 years of a life that had not been gentle, was never the dramatic act, the bold stroke, the desperate gamble, the heroic gesture performed in front of witnesses. Real survival was quieter and more stubborn than that. It was the decision made in the dark and the cold on insufficient food, with a child's cough still present in the air, to pick up a stick and draw 2 circles in the dirt and say, "This is where we begin." Tomorrow they would cross the creek and look at the north face of that hill. Tomorrow they would start. They crossed the creek at first light, before the children were fully awake, before the cold had finished making its morning argument with every exposed surface it could find. Agnes went first, testing the stepping stones she had identified the previous afternoon moving with the deliberate economy of someone who understood that a wet foot in October was not merely an inconvenience, but a problem with compounding consequences. Helen followed with Finn on her back, the boy still drowsy, his chin resting on his mother's shoulder, his breath making small clouds in the frigid air, and Clara crossed last, picking her way across the stones with a focused seriousness that Agnes recognized as inherited from no one in particular, but from the situation itself, the way certain conditions strip away the optional layers of childhood and reveal the functional core beneath. The north face of the hill was steeper than it had appeared from the ridge. Agnes stood at its base and looked up the slope for a long moment, recalibrating, adjusting her mental model against the physical reality in front of her. The pitch was perhaps 35 degrees in the middle section, easing slightly toward the base and increasing toward the crown. The soil at the surface was a thin, dark organic layer, barely 2 inches in most places, underlaid by the gray-brown clay that Agnes had expected and hoped for. She crouched and pressed her palm flat against the ground, holding it there. Cold. Deeply consistently cold, not the surface cold of frost exposure, but the kind that came from below, from the Earth's own internal temperature regulation, the thermal inertia that her grandfather had spent a summer learning to exploit. The ground here forgot warmth quickly and held cold long. That was exactly what she needed. She took the shovel and pressed its blade into the earth at the spot she had chosen roughly 6 feet up from the base of the slope, where the clay layer was thickest and the pitch was sufficient to create the elevation differential that the flue design required. The blade went in without the resistance she had feared. The surface layer gave way to the clay almost immediately, and the clay, though heavy and dense, packed cleanly around the shovel blade without crumbling. She levered the handle up and turned a full load of it onto the slope. Dark gray, smooth at the fracture surface, coherent. It would hold the shape of anything cut into it. It would not collapse without provocation. She handed the shovel to Helen and picked up the axe. "We start with the roots," her voice carrying a practical flatness that had nothing to do with coldness and everything to do with the immediate classification of the problem. "Every root we leave is a wall that won't hold." Helen looked at the slope, then at the axe, then at her own hands. She took the axe without discussion. The first hour established the basic terms of the work, which were these: the job was larger than imagination, smaller than impossibility, and would be decided entirely by the question of whether 4 people, 2 of them adults with compromised physical reserves and 2 of them children operating at the outer limit of their useful capacity, could sustain a level of effort that their bodies were not currently equipped to sustain for a period of time that was not yet calculable. Agnes had done this arithmetic in the dark the night before while the children slept, and Helen watched the fire. She had not shared the full calculation with Helen. Some numbers she had decided were more useful as private knowledge. The topsoil came off in sheets where the axe had severed the root network, each section lifted free by the shovel and tossed downslope, adding to the growing mound of displaced earth that was already taking on the character of a permanent feature of the landscape. Below the organic layer, the clay demanded a different approach. Not the single decisive stroke of the axe into root fiber, but the sustained rhythmic pressure of the shovel blade driven in by foot and levered out by body weight, each load a negotiation between the tool and the earth's resistance. Agnes established a cadence almost immediately, a cycle of motion that she refined within the first 20 minutes into something approaching mechanical efficiency: foot on the blade, weight forward handle, back load lifted and turned and dropped in one continuous arc. She did not pause between loads. She did not assess her progress. She moved the way water moves downhill, without drama, without self-congratulation, following the path of least resistance to the next necessary action. Helen worked with a different quality of energy, more forceful, less steady, burning hotter but less evenly. Her anger was still present. Agnes could see it in the set of her jaw and the way she drove the blade in with more force than was strictly required, and for now the anger was useful. Fuel was the thing that kept her moving through the accumulating ache in her arms and shoulders and lower back. Agnes did not comment on it. Anger that moved dirt was anger well spent. Clara and Finn worked in the methodology that children do when given a genuine job rather than a managed approximation of one, with total absorption, with the particular seriousness of people who have understood that the work is real and their contribution is real, And the stakes are not theoretical. They had no shovel and no axe. What they had was their hands and pieces of bark they had pulled from a fallen pine near the creek, and they used these to scoop the loosened clay from the growing excavation and carry it out, waddling with loaded skirts, dumping it on the spoil pile downslope, returning for the next load. Their faces were clay-smeared by mid-morning. Their small knuckles were raw by afternoon. They did not complain about either condition. The chamber took shape by fractions. A foot of depth became 2, became 3. The width opened from the initial test excavation to the planned 6 feet across, as Agnes moved systematically along the face, cutting the boundaries cleanly and squaring the corners with the patience of a person who understood that structural integrity began with precision in the early stages and could not be recovered once lost. The walls were smooth. She ran her palm across them periodically, checking for soft spots, for the beginning of delamination, for any sign that the clay was misbehaving. It held. Cool and dense and cooperative, the earth accepting the shape it was being asked to assume with a passivity that almost felt like collaboration. By the end of the third day, Agnes could stand upright in the center of the chamber with 6 inches of clearance above her head. The space had acquired a specific quality of air, cool, still smelling of wet clay, and darkness insulated from the wind that moved constantly across the north face of the hill outside. She stood inside it alone in the late afternoon, while Helen built the cooking fire at the camp below, and the children collected firewood from the deadfall along the creek, and she let herself experience the space for what it already was rather than what it was still becoming. A room made of earth, held together by the clay's own cohesion and the cold that kept it stable. Quiet in a way that above-ground spaces were never quiet, a deep mineral silence that had nothing to do with the absence of sound and everything to do with the presence of mass. The hill was all around her, patient and enormous, indifferent to her presence in the way that very large things are indifferent to very small things. She did not find this frightening. She found it in a way she could not have articulated to anyone clarifying. The flu was a different problem in every respect. The chamber had been a matter of sustained physical effort within a predictable set of parameters: dig down, dig wide, smooth the walls, reinforce the corners. The tunnel connecting the chamber to the fire pit was none of those things. It was narrow by design, 8 inches wide, at most barely tall enough to admit the passage of a person turned sideways, and it had to travel approximately 12 feet through undisturbed earth at a consistent slight upward grade from the fire pit to the chamber entrance, maintaining enough structural integrity along its entire length to carry smoke reliably without collapsing. The margin for error was essentially zero. A collapse in the tunnel meant days of lost work and the real possibility of injury. An inconsistent grade meant the smoke would pool rather than travel. An insufficient cross-section meant the draw would be inadequate. Every dimension mattered, and every dimension had to be achieved by feel in the dark in a space too small to swing a tool with any useful force. Agnes did most of the tunnel work herself. This was not modesty about her own capability, it was geometry. She was smaller than Helen by several inches in both height and breadth, and the physics of the passage demanded the smaller person. She worked from both ends simultaneously when possible. Helen excavating from the fire pit side while Agnes worked inward from the chamber, face, but the middle section where neither end was accessible had to be managed by Agnes alone, lying on her side in the partially completed tunnel, with the knife and a flat piece of shale scraping clay from the walls and ceiling an inch at a time, passing the loosened material back to Helen through the section Agnes had already cleared. The weight of the hill above her was a physical sensation during this work, not a metaphor. She could feel the earth's mass as a sustained, low-grade pressure across the entire surface of her body, not painful, not acute, but constant and undeniable, the way deep water feels against a swimmer, a reminder that the medium surrounding her operated according to rules that did not include her preferences. She worked through this sensation by refusing to think about it directly. She focused on the immediate task, the angle of the shale scraper, the texture of the clay at the cutting face, the question of whether the tunnel was maintaining its grade, and let the awareness of the hill's mass exist in her peripheral consciousness without moving to the center. There was one moment on the second day of tunnel work when a section of the ceiling she had not yet reinforced settled downward by perhaps 3 inches with a soft, decisive sound. Agnes did not move for a full 30 seconds. She lay in the tunnel and listened to the silence that followed the settlement and assessed as accurately as she could, in a space too dark to see clearly, whether the movement was complete or whether it was the beginning of a progressive collapse. She could hear her own heartbeat with uncomfortable clarity. The clay settled once more fractionally and then held. She waited another 30 seconds and then began moving again, this time toward that section, specifically scraping the face of the shifted ceiling back to a consistent plane and packing the gap above with clay pressed in firmly by hand. She told Helen about it that evening matter-of-factly, in the context of explaining why the reinforcement stones needed to be started immediately rather than after the full tunnel length was achieved. Helen's expression during this explanation went through several stages: alarm, suppressed fear, the specific anger of a person who has understood that someone they love has been in danger without their knowledge, and arrived at a focused, grim resolve. The following morning, Helen carried the first stones from the creek. They were heavy. This was the thing that Agnes had known intellectually and that became visceral reality the moment the first stone was lifted from the creek bed. The limestone slabs that Agnes had identified as suitable for the tunnel lining, flat, dense, broad enough to span the tunnel's width without requiring mortar, weighed between 15 and 40 pounds each depending on their dimensions. And they were wet from the creek, which added to their mass and made them treacherous in the hand. The path from the creek bed to the hill was 60 yards of uneven, frost-hardened ground that included a 3-foot scramble up the creek bank and a 20-yard section of slope at the base of the hill that became genuinely dangerous when carrying a low load that obscured the footing beneath. Clara and Finn carried the smaller stones. Agnes watched the boys' thin arms trembling with effort on the third trip and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would be more useful than the carrying itself. Finn carried his stone to the end. He carried the next one too. Agnes noted this and filed it in the same place she filed everything important, not for later use exactly, but because she had learned that the qualities of character revealed under genuine difficulty were the most accurate information about a person that life ever provided, and that information was worth keeping. The reinforcement changed the nature of the tunnel from a provisional excavation into a permanent structure. Agnes fitted each stone with the attention she would have given to a piece of fine joinery, testing the seating, adjusting the angle, ensuring that the weight was distributed cleanly to the side walls rather than hanging from the ceiling material. The stones went into the floor first, creating a surface that channeled the smoke efficiently and gave Agnes something stable to move on during the later stages of interior work. Then the walls fitted tight enough that no clay showed between courses. Then the ceiling, the most demanding part, each stone placed and checked and adjusted before the next was set. The entire assembly depending on the precision of each individual placement in a way that made the work simultaneously more painstaking and more satisfying than anything Agnes had done with her hands in years. When the tunnel was complete, lined from end to end, sloping directly connected cleanly to the base of the chamber on one end and the fire pit on the other, Agnes walked the full length of it on her hands and knees, running her palm along the stone surface, checking the grade by feel, feeling for any irregularity in the ceiling that might signal a future problem. She found 2 spots she was not satisfied with and spent an additional afternoon correcting them. Helen did not ask why she was being so precise. By this point, 3 weeks into the work, Helen had developed a functional understanding of Agnes's relationship to thoroughness. It was not perfectionism. It was not anxiety. It was simply the operating principle of a mind that had learned that shortcuts in foundational work revealed themselves at the worst possible moments. The chamber lining came next. This was less fraught than the tunnel work, but more physically demanding in a different way. The stones were larger here, sized to the 6-foot width of the chamber walls, and fitting them required the kind of sustained, full-body effort that left both women unable to straighten their arms fully by the end of each day's work. They developed a system. Agnes positioned each stone, Clara and Finn steadied it from below. While Agnes checked the seating, Helen drove it into final position with the shovel head used as a setting tool. It was slow, it was methodical. It proceeded with the pace of something that intended to last. Agnes left the ventilation gaps deliberately. 3 sets of paired openings near the crown of the chamber ceiling, each gap roughly 2 fingers wide, positioned to allow the accumulated smoke to bleed out slowly over time once the curing was complete and the door was open. Too large and the coal would penetrate and undermine the temperature consistency. Too small and the smoke would back up and the pressure differential that drove the flow through the flue would collapse. She had thought about the sizing for days before committing to it, working through the logic each night by firelight, while the children slept, and when she finally cut the gaps, she did so with confidence. The door was the last piece and the only element of the structure that would be apparent from the outside, the thing that would mark this mound of earth as something made rather than something found. Agnes felled a young pine with the axe, a straight-grained specimen she had identified 2 days earlier. She split the trunk into planks, working along the grain, producing pieces that were rough but structurally sound. The frame she built from the thicker pieces fitted at the corners with half-lap joints, cut freehand with the knife and tested by eye. The door panels she fitted to the frame with the leather from 2 shoe soles, Helen's and Agnes's own, cut from footwear already worn past usefulness. The sacrifice noticed and set aside without comment. The result was a door that was not beautiful, but it sealed. Agnes tested it a dozen times, opening and closing, it feeling for air movement, at the edges, adjusting the leather hinges until the gap was minimal. It's sealed. She stood back from the finished structure in the late afternoon of what she calculated was the 21st day since they had been expelled from the cabin. The hill looked from any distance greater than 10 yards like a hill. The door set into its face was the only anomaly, and even that from a distance read more as a natural feature than a constructed one. Agnes felt looking at it something that she recognized as pride, but that was more specific than the general category. It was the pride of precision of a thing done correctly under difficult conditions, of a mind that had seen past the obstacle to the mechanism and had been right about the mechanism and had executed it well enough that the result was standing in front of her as evidence. A smokehouse without smoke was an architecture. A smokehouse without meat was a monument to intention without consequence. The distinction mattered. Agnes knew this the way she knew everything that mattered, not as abstract principle, but as operational reality. They had built the machine. Now they needed to run it. And running it required a successful hunt, which required a different set of skills from construction and was subject to a set of variables that Agnes's planning could influence but could not control. She had been laying the trap lines while the construction proceeded, working in the early mornings before the light was strong enough for stonework moving along the game trail she had found running along the base of the ridge. She had spent 2 mornings simply observing, sitting downwind in the pre-dawn cold, watching the trail, recording in the ledger of her attention the timing and direction of the animals that used it, the places they paused, the features of the terrain that funneled their movement. The 3rd morning she had set the first snares using the cord she had twisted from stripped inner bark ash and hickory, alternated for strength and flexibility, and positioned them at the narrowing points in the trail where the terrain's geometry created natural constriction. The first 4 days produced 2 rabbits and a large gray squirrel. The rabbits were useful. The squirrel provided less. None of it was what the smokehouse required. What it required was volume, a quantity of meat sufficient to justify the system, enough to create a meaningful reserve against the deep winter that was now Agnes could see from the behavior of the creek and the quality of the light and the angle of the shadows at midday. Perhaps 2 weeks away. She needed deer. The larger snare she had constructed for this purpose was positioned near a stand of late-holding berry shrubs she had found on the creek's far side, a location that represented, based on her observations of the trail system, the most probable path for a deer moving between the higher brows on the ridge and the creek water in the lower valley. She had built the trigger mechanism with particular care. The deadfall weighted with a flat stone she had carried from a different section of the creek specifically because its density was right. The trip cord placed at a height and tension calibrated for the leg of an animal between 70 and 100 pounds. She had checked this snare each morning, along with the others, and each morning for 4 consecutive days it had been undisturbed. On the 5th morning, she crossed the creek in the gray pre-dawn and made her way along the far bank to the berry thicket, and saw, while she was still 30 yards away, that the trip cord was gone from its position. She stopped. She listened. From the thicket, a sound, a sustained rhythmic disturbance in the undergrowth, not random but repetitive, the specific sound of something pulling against constraint in a regular cycle. Her heart rate shifted slightly. She moved to the edge of the thicket and looked through the outer screen of dried stems. A young buck, one of the season's last, his velvet long shed, one foreleg caught above the knee in the snare cord. He was pulling steadily against the line, not in panic, but with the methodical persistence of an animal that had not yet fully understood its situation, and each pull tightened the knot rather than loosening it. Agnes looked at him for a long moment, his brown coat, his dark eyes wide and rolling the white flag of his tail flicking in distress. She was 60 years old and had killed and dressed more animals than she could count. And she felt, looking at this particular buck on this particular morning, no satisfaction and no reluctance, only the clean, clear-eyed recognition of necessity, which was its own kind of respect for the animal in question. She went back to camp and returned with Helen. What followed occupied most of the morning. Agnes had done this work before. Helen had done it before. They worked without theatrics and without waste, moving through the established sequence of each task with the focused competence of people who have understood that sentiment, however genuine, had its own time, and this was not it. The hide came off in one clean piece, which Agnes folded and set aside with care, tanned correctly. Deer hide was the warmest and most durable material available to them, and they needed both warmth and durability more than they needed almost anything. The carcass was divided along the standard lines, Agnes's knife moving through the work with the efficiency of long practice. The best cuts they set aside for immediate use, they would eat properly tonight, the first real meal in weeks. The remainder, the haunches, the back straps, the secondary cuts that could be sliced thin enough for curing, Agnes trimmed carefully, removing the fat where it was heavy, leaving it where it provided structural integrity to the slice. She cut the pieces into strips of consistent thickness. Each strip was rubbed with salt, the last of the supply, a calculation Agnes had made and accepted, and laid on the flat surface of the largest stone while the next was cut. Finn had recovered from the worst of his cough over the preceding 2 weeks. The work had kept them warm enough, the small fires adequate for the purpose, and the drier air in the protected camp below the hill had been better for him than the exposed rock overhang of the first nights. Standing now at the edge of the activity, watching his grandmother's hands move through the work, he asked, "Will it really keep all winter?" Agnes did not look up from the cut she was making. "If we do this right," her voice measured and certain, "this meat will be good past the first thaw. Smoke and time do what no amount of heat can they change, what the meat is not just what it looks like." She carried the first strips into the smokehouse herself. The chamber was cold and dark and smelled of new stone and clay, and Agnes moved through it without hesitation, knowing the dimensions from 3 weeks of work, reaching up to place each strip over the wooden rods they had fitted across the ceiling with at intervals of 12 inches. The strips hung straight, separated from each other. The spacing, deliberate, adequate airflow between them was as important as any other variable in the system. When the last strip was hung, Agnes stood in the chamber and looked up at them in the thin light coming through the open door and felt the structure around her as a complete thing for the first time. The stone walls, the hanging meat, the cold air, the dark. A system in its final configuration waiting to be activated. She sealed the door and walked down the slope to the fire pit. The wood selection had occupied a portion of her thinking for the better part of a week. She had identified a fallen hickory 3 days after moving to the site, a mature tree dead long enough that the bark had begun to separate, but the heartwood was still dense and dry, the color of good cured leather at the center of each split piece. She had also located a red oak whose broken lower limb had left a section of the trunk exposed and drying for what looked like 2 seasons. She had set both aside, carrying selected pieces back to the camp each day. She added now a collection of green material, young branch tips from the creek willows, and a double handful of damp leaves from the low ground near the water's edge. These would not provide heat. They would provide volume, the dense white smoke that would carry the largest quantity of active compounds into the system for a given size of fire. Agnes built the fire in the pit with the deliberateness of a person who understood that this particular fire was the operational test of everything the previous 3 weeks had produced. She started it small, a core of dry hickory, finger-thick pieces that caught cleanly from the spark, and built a reliable base of heat. She fed it gradually, adding larger pieces of oak as the core stabilized, watching the flame establish itself at the size she wanted. Modest, hot enough to generate a consistent smoke volume, not so large that it would overwhelm the flue's capacity or generate the heat that was the enemy of the whole enterprise. When the fire was at the correct size and burning steadily, she began adding the green material in the small, regular additions. watching the smoke column shift from the clean gray of dry wood combustion to the denser, whiter output of suppressed fire meeting live material. The smoke thickened. It gathered at the rim of the fire pit, and then instead of rising freely into the air, as it would have over an open fire, it was drawn down and inward pulled by the pressure differential between the warmer fire pit and the cooler chamber above, finding the entrance to the stone-lined tunnel and disappearing into it. Agnes watched this happen with the specific attention she gave to the confirmation of a prediction. The draw was working. The grade was correct. The tunnel was doing what it had been designed to do. Helen stood beside her. They both looked at the fire pit where the smoke was pulling underground with the quiet, purposeful movement of a current. "It's working." Helen's voice was barely above a breath, stripped of its usual register, operating somewhere below emotion in the pure register of observation. Agnes did not answer immediately. She was watching the top of the hill where the ventilation gaps would eventually show the smoke's arrival in the chamber. She waited. 2 minutes. 3. And then from the crown of the mound, the first faint wisps appeared, not the dense output of a fire burning freely, but something thin and slow, barely distinguishable from morning mist. The smoke had traveled 12 feet through the earth, surrendered its heat to the stone and clay around it, and arrived in the chamber cool and present, and carrying everything that mattered about it. Agnes felt something move through her that was not triumph. Triumph was too loud, but was closer to the quiet satisfaction of a proof completed. The hypothesis had held. She maintained the fire for the next 3 days and 2 nights, feeding it in regular cycles, keeping it at consistent size and temperature, adding green material on the same schedule. She adjusted for wind direction twice on the second day, when a shift in the weather temporarily disrupted the pressure differential and caused the draw to falter. She corrected this by partially blocking the fire pit opening on the windward side with a flat stone, redirecting the airflow to restore the differential. The correction worked within 15 minutes. She made a mental note of the principle for future reference. Helen asked on the second morning, "How do we know if it's working inside, I mean?" Agnes was tending the fire. "We don't, not until we open the door." She kept her voice even. "That's what waiting is for. Not patience for its own sake, patience because the system needs time to do what brute force cannot. You cannot rush what the smoke does. You can only make sure the conditions are right and then leave it alone." Helen sat with that for a moment. Then, and if it hasn't worked, Agnes turned a piece of hickory in the fire. "Then we learn what went wrong, and we do it again." The waiting was its own kind of difficulty, carrying a quality distinct from the difficulty of the work. The work had been painful and exhausting, and had pushed them past what they had known they were capable of. The waiting required something different, a willingness to have invested everything in a thing that could not yet be verified, to hold the possibility of failure in the same mental space as the hope of success without letting either one collapse the other. Agnes was accustomed to this kind of waiting. She knew how to make herself useful while she waited, how to direct her hands to other tasks, without allowing the waiting to become its primary quality. She spent the mornings repairing their footwear and laying a second set of snares further up the creek. She worked the deer hide each evening, checking the penetration of the clay tanning compound into the skin, tracking the progress of a different kind of patient chemistry. On the fourth day, she could wait no longer. The morning was clear and sharp. Cold, already absolute at dawn, the sky above the hill a pale, clean blue that held no warmth in it. Agnes walked up the slope alone. She stopped in front of the door and put her hand on the wood. She could feel through the planks the faintest possible suggestion of resistance, not pressure, but density, the sense of an atmosphere on the other side of the door that was different from the atmosphere outside it. She unlatched it and pulled. The smoke came out in a slow, rolling exhalation, cool against her face, smelling of hickory, and something deeper and more complex underneath the smell of the curing itself, the particular combination of chemistry and time that had been working in the dark for 3 days. She let it clear and stepped inside. The strips of venison had changed completely. They were not raw, they were not cooked. They were something that had no previous existence in Agnes's experience until this moment, a deep, rich brown at the surface, the color of cured mahogany, dry and firm to the touch, when she pressed a fingertip against one and felt the resistance of preserved protein rather than the give of living tissue. She took one strip down. She cut a piece from its end with a knife. She put it in her mouth and chewed. Salt and smoke, and something savory and deep. That was the venison itself concentrated by the process distilled by 3 days of cool aromatic chemistry into a density of flavor that had no precedent in the family's recent experience, which had been mostly thin broths and boiled acorns in the memory of better meals. She stood in the smokehouse for a long moment, chewing, letting the information assemble itself. Then she walked to the door and called Helen's name. Helen came up the slope with both children, their faces carrying the same careful expression, hope being managed against the possibility that it would have to be immediately retracted, the specific look of people who have learned that anticipation is expensive and should not be spent freely. Agnes handed Helen a piece without speaking. Helen put it in her mouth. She chewed twice. Her eyes changed, not dramatically, not with tears, but with a shift in their quality that moved them from the guarded flatness of sustained endurance to something more open, more present, more recognizably her own face before the past years had layered it with their weight. She looked at Agnes and Agnes looked back, and between them passed the specific communication of two people who have done an enormous thing together and arrived together at its confirmation. Clara and Finn each ate a piece. Finn, who had not smiled with any fullness since the first night on the stoop, smiled now. It was a small smile, incomplete, uncertain of its own permission, but it was there, and Agnes saw it and held it in the most protected part of her awareness, where she kept the things that genuinely mattered, where they could not be reached by cold or hunger or by men with dry voices and final-sounding decisions. The smokehouse worked. The days that followed were organized by a different logic than the days before. They had a buffer now, not comfort, not security in any absolute sense, but the specific operational advantage of a system producing output. Agnes set immediate priorities: more fuel wood for the smokehouse fire, a second successful hunt, before the deep cold locked the landscape, the continued progress on the deer hide tanning. She had Helen begin work on expanding their sleeping shelter, using the construction methods they had developed on a smaller scale, a lean-to against the south face of a rock formation near the camp, backed by the stone and partially floored with pine needle insulation, tighter against the wind than anything they had slept in since the first night. In the final days of October, while the first smokehouse cycle was still completing, Agnes took the snare line up to the creek's far side where a doe had been leaving sign consistently for 4 days. The second snare was larger than the first, the trigger mechanism adjusted for a heavier animal. She took the doe on the third morning, the clean catch, a clean finish, and the processing and second curing cycle began before the week was out. By the time the November cold announced itself in earnest, both cycles hung completed in the dark of the chamber, and their supply calculation had moved from precarious to something that could be called, for the first time, adequate. She was checking the new snares one morning, 3 days after the second curing cycle finished, when she heard footsteps. Not the sound of deer or of any animal she recognized from its approach pattern. These were human footsteps, the specific rhythm of a man walking with a long stride and significant weight moving through the underbrush, with the practiced quiet of someone accustomed to the woods, but not attempting to be silent. Agnes had the axe in her hand. She positioned herself with the creek bank behind her and her back to the tree line and waited. The man who emerged from the pines was tall and very lean, dressed in buckskin that had been repaired many times, with mismatched thread, carrying a long rifle in the crook of his left arm, with the habitual ease of something that had been there for decades. He was perhaps 50, weathered to a condition where precise age became difficult to assess his face, a landscape of exposure and experience, and the particular kind of quiet that came from spending most of one's time in places where there was nothing to talk to. He stopped when he saw Agnes. His eyes went immediately to the axe. Agnes looked at him. He looked at her. The clearing between them was small enough that they were approximately 10 feet apart, and in those 10 feet, the full assessment of two people who live by accurate reading of situations was exchanged in approximately 4 seconds. She lowered the axe. Not all the way, she held it at her side rather than raising it to working position, a distinction that was both accurate and legible. His rifle stayed where it was, the barrel pointed at nothing in particular. A working détente was established without a word being spoken. His name, when he eventually offered it, was Ben. He was a trapper working the creek systems through the hills for marten and mink, following his line from the north. He had been following this particular creek for 2 days and had come across their camp at the base of the hill that morning while Agnes was checking snares. Helen had given him directions after a period of the same careful mutual assessment that Agnes had just conducted. He had the manner of a man who had long since stopped expecting the world to contain surprises and had arrived at something like professional appreciation for them when they appeared. Agnes offered him the fire. She sliced 2 pieces of cured venison from the current Smokehouse stock, enough to communicate the gesture of hospitality without being reckless with supply, and set them in front of him. He looked at the meat before he touched it, picked it up, brought it to his nose. She watched his expression go through a sequence: recognition, recalibration, curiosity, that told her more about the quality of what she had made than any judgment she could apply to her own work. He bit into it, chewed slowly with deliberate attention. His eyes, which had been directed generally toward the middle distance, in the manner of people who have learned not to give away what they are thinking, moved to the door set into the hillside with a focus that was unmistakably engaged. Best cured venison I've eaten in some years. His voice roughened by long stretches of silence between uses. And I've eaten a great deal of it. Not cooked through, not dried out. How do you manage it without a proper house? Agnes pointed to the door in the hill. He walked over to it with her permission and looked inside for a long time. She watched him trace the logic of the system with his eyes, the hanging rods, the stone walls, the ventilation gaps at the ceiling. Then he walked to the fire pit and crouched beside it and looked at the tunnel entrance, and she watched him trace the 12-foot path with his gaze following the grade up to the chamber, arriving at the conclusion that the smoke traveled through the earth to reach the meat. He sat with this for a moment. Built right into the north face, his voice carrying the specific quality of admiration that belongs to one practical person examining another's work. So the ground keeps it cold while the smoke does the curing. Never seen it done that way, never thought of it. He stayed 2 days. He had salt, a full sack of it, more than Agnes had allowed herself to plan for. He had flour enough for bread over weeks. He had coffee small in quantity, but real. He had a skinning knife with a blade that held its edge better than anything Agnes had worked with in the past month. He had 2 wool blankets, the kind with density enough to function in genuine cold. Against all of this, he set what he had seen in the smokehouse. They negotiated in the practical shorthand of 2 people for whom the underlying logic of a fair exchange was self-evident. Agnes watched him across the fire as they worked through the terms, and she recognized in his approach to the transaction a version of her own, each item assessed on its actual utility rather than its nominal value. Each concession made not from social obligation, but from genuine calculation of mutual benefit. The cured venison he would carry was food of a quality not easily replicated on the trail. The supplies he provided were the difference for Agnes's family between a survivable winter and a genuinely secure one. They shook hands on it. Ben packed the venison, carefully wrapping it in the cloth he had traded as a part of the arrangement, and loaded it into his pack. Before he left the following morning, he stood once more in front of the smokehouse and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at Agnes with an expression that contained something she had not expected to see in a stranger's face in this particular season of her life. It was respect, not pity, not the condescending appreciation of someone who finds ingenuity charming in an unexpected source. The straightforward, one professional to another recognition of work done correctly under difficult conditions. He had seen what she built. He had understood it. He had judged it on its actual merits. Agnes received this without false modesty and without making too much of it. She simply met his gaze and nodded, and he shouldered his pack and walked north along the creek and was gone within 2 minutes into the same pines he had emerged from 2 days earlier. Helen stood beside Agnes, and they both watched the space where he had been until it was simply the creek bank again, ordinary and cold and quiet. They were producers now. They had built something of value in a place where nothing of value had existed before. They had made a transaction on equal terms. Helen's voice, when she finally spoke, was not the voice of the woman who had stood on the frozen stoop 3 weeks ago, smothering a sob in the sharp air. It was something harder-edged and more certain, the voice of a person who has done something that cannot be undone and has understood in the doing of it a new set of things about what she is capable of. We are not what Marcus said we were. Agnes watched the creek. We never were, her voice quiet and absolute. He was simply the last one to know it. Above them, the thin smoke from the smokehouse fire moved up through the ventilation gaps and dissolved into the clear November sky, faint and persistent and steady, a signal to anyone who knew how to read it that something real was happening in this hillside, something durable, something that intended to last the winter and well beyond it. November arrived without transition. There was no gradual adjustment, no polite announcement of what was coming. One morning, the creek was moving freely, its surface catching the early light in the usual way, and the next morning, the edges were locked under ice that extended 6 inches from each bank and held its position even through the midday hours when the sun was at its highest and most committed. The temperature had dropped below the threshold where recovery between night and day was possible, and it stayed there. The hills went gray and then white, and then a blue-white that had no warmth in it at any hour, and the wind that came from the northwest carried a quality of cold that was not simply low temperature, but something more structural, a cold that pressed against exposed skin with the persistence of something that intended to stay permanently and was simply waiting for the right moment to prove it. Agnes watched this happen with the attention of someone who had been expecting it and had used the preceding weeks to prepare for it with the specific, unforgiving logic of a person who cannot afford to be surprised. The smokehouse was stocked from both curing cycles. The supply, by Agnes's careful calculation, represented approximately 11 weeks of adequate protein for 4 people if managed with the same discipline they had applied to everything else in this period of their lives. 11 weeks took them to mid-January. After that, they would need to hunt again. But mid-January was a knowable problem at a calculable distance, which was an entirely different category of challenge from the open-ended emergency of their first days in the hills. The lean-to Helen had built against the south-facing rock formation had been improved steadily, each modification driven by the information that the previous night's cold had provided. The walls were now double-layered, the space between the layers packed with pine needle insulation that Agnes had tested against the inside face of her palm and found satisfactory, not warm but resistant, slowing the transfer of cold from outside to inside in a way that the single-layer original had not managed. The floor was elevated 4 inches off the ground on a platform of small-diameter logs that kept the sleeping surface away from the ground cold that crept upward through any material in direct contact with frozen earth. They had added a curtain of stitched deer hide hung in front of the opening that reduced the wind's entry without eliminating the ventilation that a contained fire required. The fire itself had been moved inside a decision Agnes had made when a second cold snap threatened to revisit the conditions that had produced Finn's earlier cough. The smoke she managed with a clay-lined channel that directed the worst of the output upward through a gap in the roof structure, imperfect but sufficient. They were not comfortable. Comfort was not the relevant standard. They were functional, which meant they were alive and capable of the work that keeping them alive required, which was the only standard that mattered in November in the hills, with winter committing itself outside the walls. What they had built in the 6 weeks since their expulsion was a system, not a single structure or a single solution, but an interlocking set of practices and physical arrangements that worked together the way the parts of a clock work together, each element dependent on the others, the whole capable of producing something that none of the parts could produce independently. The smokehouse was the heart of it, providing the food preservation capacity that freed them from the daily emergency of immediate hunger. The shelter was the envelope that made the rest possible. The trap lines which Agnes maintained with the same systematic attention she gave to everything provided the raw material that the smokehouse required, and the variety that kept the diet from collapsing to a single dimension. The water supply, the creek, partially frozen but accessible where the current was strongest, managed with a specific morning routine of ice clearing that Agnes performed before any other task, was the element that could become a crisis fastest and therefore received first attention every day without exception. Helen had changed in ways that Agnes observed with the same careful attention she applied to everything that mattered. The woman who had stood on the frozen stoop in October had been extended, not replaced by a version of herself that carried an additional quality. It was not toughness exactly, though toughness was present. It was more like competence that had been tested to its limit and had not failed, in which now resided in Helen's body as a kind of structural confidence, visible in the way she moved through the camp, the way she assessed problems, the way she spoke to the children about what needed to be done and why. Clara had become in this same period her mother's practical partner in a way that had not been possible inside the structured dependencies of the settlement's community life. Out here, capacity determined role. Clara had capacity more of it each week, and Agnes gave her real work and received real results from it and calibrated her expectations upward accordingly. The girl was becoming a different kind of 10-year-old than she would have been in for those community walls, more direct, more observant, more comfortable with the gap between what she knew and what she needed to learn, and less frightened of that gap than most adults Agnes had known. Finn had grown quieter in a way that was not withdrawal but concentration, drilling down into things rather than spreading wider across them. He had developed without instruction a detailed knowledge of the creek's ice behavior that Agnes found genuinely useful. He knew which sections were solid and which were deceptive, knew the sounds the ice made under different temperature conditions and what those sounds indicated about load-bearing capacity, knew where the muskrats were working under the ice and what that meant about water depth and current speed. He had learned all of this by watching. Agnes recognized this quality immediately. It was the early formation of the same faculty she had carried her whole life, not taught, not imitated, but native in orientation of consciousness toward the actual rather than the imagined. The settlement was 3 miles to the south and several hundred feet lower in elevation at the bottom of the valley, where the creek widened and the agricultural land began. Agnes could not see it from their camp. She thought about it in the way she thought about the other variables she could not control with accuracy rather than anxiety, noting its existence and its characteristics, and then moving on to the variables she could influence. The story of what they had built was moving through the settlement in the way stories move through small, isolated communities, not by any single telling, but by accumulation, by the same account, arriving from multiple directions with consistent details that gave it the ring of something real. Ben had stopped at the settlement's general store in the first week of November to trade a season's worth of furs. In the course of the exchange, he had produced from the inner pocket of his buckskin jacket a piece of the cured venison he had traded for at Agnes's camp. He offered it without preamble to the storekeeper, a man named Wallace, who had been in this valley for 15 years and fancied himself a judge of useful things. Wallace took it with the skepticism of a man being offered something unfamiliar by someone he trusted professionally but not uncritically, and ate it and then looked at what remained in his hand with an expression that Ben recognized as the first stage of a question. Ben told the story plainly the way he told all stories, without embellishment, with only the sequence of events and the specific technical details that gave the account its credibility. A woman and her family in the hills. A smokehouse built into the north face of a slope, a stone-lined tunnel running 12 feet through the earth, the cold smoke, the cured venison, the quality that he, a man who had been eating his own trail-cured meat for 30 years, had not been able to match in his own practice. The conversation expanded as conversations in general stores tended to include the 2 other men present, a farmer named Aldrich, who had come in for lamp oil and stayed for the entire account, and an older man whose name Ben did not catch, who sat near the door and said nothing but whose attention was absolute. By the time Ben collected his trade goods and left, the story had been told in full to 4 people, each of whom would tell it to others before the day was out. At first it circulated as curiosity, the improbable account of the family that had been sent away and had apparently not died and had apparently built something remarkable. The community had not in general permitted itself to feel much guilt about the expulsion. Marcus had presented the choice as a necessity and the necessity as obvious, and most families had allowed themselves to be managed in this direction because the alternative, examining their own participation in what had been done, was more uncomfortable than the guilt a more honest accounting would have produced. But the story of the smokehouse was stubborn because it was not only a story about Agnes and what she had managed to survive, it was also implicitly a story about the gap between what Marcus had said about her and what had turned out to be demonstrably true. He had said she was a drain. The smokehouse said otherwise. The community had accepted his arithmetic on faith. The smokehouse offered a different set of numbers. As November progressed and the promised hard winter committed itself to the valley, the story's emotional weight shifted. The harvest had been poor. The grain stores were tracking behind where they needed to be. The deer had moved to higher ground earlier than usual, and the men who went out came back with less than they needed and more coal than they had bargained for. The children were the visible measure of this deterioration in the pallor settling into their faces in the illness, moving through the clustered households in the listlessness that comes from a body operating consistently below its caloric minimum. The mothers saw it first, as mothers always do, and their understanding moved through the community in the days before it reached the level at which Marcus was required to respond to it. Marcus had maintained through the first weeks of November the posture of a man whose decisions had been correct. He was skilled at this, the management of narrative around his own actions, the application of enough confidence and institutional authority to keep the community's interpretation of events aligned with his preferred version of them. But the story of the smokehouse had found the gap between what he had said Agnes was worth and what she had turned out to be worth, and this gap was widening daily. The silence when he passed groups of people who stopped talking at his approach was different from the respectful silence of previous seasons. It contained now an edge of withheld judgment that he could feel as a physical pressure. And he felt it most acutely in the faces of the mothers whose children were sick and who looked at him with an assessment that arrived at the plain question underneath everything: what are you going to do about this? He had no answer that was both honest and flattering to himself, which had always been the kind of answer he preferred. He spent 3 days in the private arithmetic of his own pride, measuring it against what he was being asked to surrender in order to solve the problem in front of him, and finding that the arithmetic came out the same way each time, regardless of how he approached it. He could not solve the problem from inside the settlement with the resources the settlement currently possessed. The one person within range who had the resources that could change the calculation was Agnes. And reaching Agnes required a journey he had been successfully avoiding in his own mind for 3 weeks by the application of increasingly strained reasoning. On the morning of the 15th of November, with 8 inches of new snow on the ground from a storm that had moved through the previous 2 days and left the valley sealed in a white that had no bottom to it, Marcus put on his heaviest coat and his boots and walked north out of the settlement. He told no one where he was going. He did not have a story prepared for where he was going that would survive contact with the person he was going to find, and he had enough self-awareness left to know that pretending otherwise would only cost him whatever remained of his dignity by the time he arrived. He followed the creek, which was the only reliable navigation in the snow-buried landscape where the usual landmarks were buried or altered beyond recognition. The creek was partially frozen, but the center current was still moving, and he kept it on his right and walked with the grim, mechanical persistence of a man who has made a decision and is now simply executing it before he can talk himself out of it. The cold was absolute. His breath came in short clouds that the wind took immediately. The snow was deep enough in places to require a kind of high-stepping effort that was exhausting in a way flat walking was not. And by the time he had covered the first mile, his legs were already registering the complaint. He walked for close to 2 hours. He had not known exactly where the camp was. The story Ben had told at Wallace's store had given him the general direction and the approximate terrain feature, and the creek provided the corridor. After 2 hours of following both, he detected something that stopped him where he stood. He stood still in the snow and breathed and realized after a moment that what he was detecting was smell. Smoke, not the acrid flat smoke of green wood or the sharp brightness of pine, but something deeper and more complex, carrying the specific aromatic signature of hardwood and something else underneath it, something that arrived in his stomach as hunger before it arrived in his brain as recognition. Hickory, and beneath the hickory the unmistakable compound smell of curing meat. He followed it upwind. The camp resolved from the landscape as he came around a bend in the creek, the rock formation on the south side, the lean-to built against it with its hide curtain, the fire circle with its low morning flame, and there on the north face of the hill, across the frozen creek, a wooden door set into the slope. A thing that should not exist in a place where no one had any right to be surviving, let alone building. He stood at the edge of the camp and took in what was in front of him. 4 people alive and functional in the middle of November in a winter that was already closing its fist around the valley. He could see this from the details, the orderly arrangement of the camp, the woodpile that had been systematically built and maintained, the condition of the lean-to, which was clearly a deliberate construction and not a makeshift. The deer hide stretched and waited at the edge of the clearing, in the final stage of a tanning process that someone had managed correctly. The children were visible near the lean-to entrance. Clara, whom he had known since her birth, wearing a coat that had not existed in October, clearly deerskin, self-constructed, and roughly but functionally fitted, her face bearing an expression of assessment when she saw him that was not a child's expression at all. Helen saw him before Agnes did. She came out of the lean-to with a piece of firewood in her hand and looked across the frozen creek and found him standing at its edge, and her face went through a sequence of changes that took approximately 2 seconds and arrived at an expression of cold, specific fury that Marcus had never seen directed at him from any face in his life. It was not the hot anger of a person acting on immediate emotion. It was the settled, distilled, carefully preserved anger of a woman who has had 3 weeks to think about exactly this moment and has thought about it thoroughly. She moved to the near bank of the creek, putting herself between him and the camp, with the automatic positioning of a person who has been tested and has not found herself wanting. "What do you want?" Her voice cut across the frozen air with the directness of a tool properly applied. Marcus did not answer immediately. His attention had moved against his will to the smokehouse door, a fixed point his gaze kept returning to, regardless of where he tried to direct it, the way the eye returns to a source of light in an otherwise dark room. Helen waited, and her waiting was itself a form of pressure containing within it everything she was choosing not to say, while she determined what he was going to do. Agnes appeared from behind the rock formation, coming from the upper trap line, the axe on her shoulder in the habitual carrying position that meant she had been moving through the woods. She saw Marcus and stopped. Not the stop of surprise. Agnes did not stop for surprise, having long since trained herself against it, but the stop of a person who has been expecting a visitor and is now calibrating the precise version of the visitor who has arrived against the several versions she had prepared for. She read him at the distance of 30 yards, the way she read everything, the stooped shoulders that had replaced the authoritative set she had known for 20 years, the way the cold had gotten into his beard and left ice crystals that he had not troubled to remove, the particular quality of his stillness at the creek bank, which was the stillness of a man who has used all of his prepared resources and is standing in front of a problem that none of them address. She crossed the frozen creek and stood in front of him and said nothing. She let the silence be what it was. He swallowed once. The sound was audible in the frozen quiet. The children in the settlement, his voice rougher than she had known it, stripped of its customary smoothness by the cold and by something that operated at a different level than cold. "They're sick, several of them. We have no meat. We've been hunting, but the deer have moved up." He paused. "I've come to ask about a trade." Helen's response was immediate and full. "A trade? You have nothing we want. You sent us out with 3 days of food and a death sentence in November, and now you come asking us for something. Let them starve, Marcus. Let them feel exactly what you made us feel. Let them learn what it costs to be thrown away by people who were supposed to be their community." Her words went out into the cold air and hung there sharp-edged and true, each one carrying the weight of the specific remembered experience that had produced it. They were not rhetorical. They were the exact report of what had been done and what it had cost and what she had concluded from both. Marcus received them without flinching, which Agnes noted there was at least no pretense left in him, no performance of injured dignity, which would have been the final possible form of insult and which he apparently did not have available. Agnes listened to her daughter's fury and recognized in it the full legitimate force of what had been earned. She had felt the same fire herself in the earliest days, had held it and examined it and understood its justice completely. She looked at Marcus now and felt something entirely different, something that occupied a different temperature range than fury, and that she had arrived at not by suppressing the anger, but by going all the way through it to the other side where the landscape was wider and quieter, and the decisions made there were better in every applicable sense. She had already won. This was the fact that organized everything else she was about to say and do. The victory was not something that would be conferred by this conversation. It was already complete, established in the stones of the smokehouse walls, in the quality of the cured meat hanging in the dark, and the expressions on her grandchildren's faces when they found the first batch cured and ready. Nothing Marcus said or did from this point forward could alter that. She was negotiating from a position that had nothing in it that resembled need, and Marcus, whatever else he had lost in the past weeks, was intelligent enough to feel that asymmetry immediately. She held up a hand not to silence Helen, though it had that effect, but because she was ready to speak and the conversation needed to move from the register of justified grievance to the register of practical transaction, which was the only register in which anything useful was going to be accomplished. Helen stopped speaking. Agnes kept her eyes on Marcus. "We will trade," her voice carrying no anger, no warmth, no performance of either mercy or severity, only the even certain quality of a person who knows exactly what she is doing. Helen turned to her mama, no. The two words contained an entire argument. Agnes did not shift her gaze from Marcus. She was not unmindful of her daughter's position. She had listened to it fully and accorded it full weight and had not set it aside carelessly. What she had concluded in the full accounting was that the children in the settlement were not Marcus. They had not sat on the council. They had not made the calculation that produced the October evening. They were children who were sick and hungry in November, which was a fact that existed independently of the question of who bore responsibility for their condition, and it was a fact that she was capable of affecting, and she was going to affect it. She began, not for money. Your currency has no use here. She watched Marcus's face. His expression had the quality of a man prepared to accept any terms, which was itself information. It told her how badly things were in the settlement, and it told her how much room she had in what followed. She had thought about this list for longer than she would have admitted, had assembled and adjusted it through the same careful process she applied to any construction that needed to hold weight. Each item was a specific tool for a specific future vulnerability. None of it was punitive, all of it was necessary. 2 milk goats delivered to this camp at the first spring thaw. Not promised. Delivered. She watched him receive this. 10 bags of seed grain, wheat and corn in equal measure, suitable for spring planting. She watched him again. The deed to this hillside and the surrounding 50 acres written and witnessed by at least 2 people who are not under your authority. She watched him carefully on this one. The land was the most important item, the foundation of everything else. The difference between occupying a place and owning it, between being tolerated on someone else's land and having the ground beneath your feet belong to you in the only way that mattered in law. And every tool from my husband's workshop, his adze, his planes, his chisels, his wedges, every last piece returned to me in full. Marcus was nodding before she finished each item, the agreement coming too quickly and too completely to contain any real resistance, which confirmed what she had already calculated. She had not yet said the most important thing. She paused, letting the list settle, and then shifted something in her voice, not raising it, not hardening it, but bringing it to a different quality of directness, a proximity that had nothing to do with volume. And one more condition. She let those 4 words exist in the air by themselves for a moment. You will stand before the settlement, all of it, every family, and you will tell them the truth. Not a version of it that protects your position. The truth. That you cast us out not because we could not contribute, but because you had decided we could not contribute. That the decision was yours, made before the winter arrived, based on a calculation about our worth that was wrong. That you were wrong. She held his gaze. You will say our name clearly, and you will restore what you took from it, which is the only thing you took from us that cannot be replaced by goats or grain or tools. You will do this in front of witnesses who will remember it. The silence that followed this was different from all the silences that had preceded it in this conversation. It was not the silence of resistance or of calculation or of preparation. It was the silence of a man who has arrived at the exact location of what his choices have cost him and is standing in it without any remaining capacity to look away. Marcus was not a young man. He had spent the better part of a lifetime building and maintaining the authority that what she was asking would now publicly and permanently diminish. She was not asking him to pay a fine or to make restitution with material things, though she was asking for those too. She was asking him to perform in front of everyone who had organized their behavior around his judgment, the precise act that would demonstrate that his judgment had been wrong. It was the highest possible price she could have asked for, and she was asking for it because it was the only price that addressed the actual harm, which was not the cold nights, or the hunger, or the danger, all of which they had transcended with their own capabilities, but the theft of standing the erasure of their worth from the community's accounting. Helen was watching Agnes with an expression that had moved past the first fury into something more complicated and more considered. She was not yet at peace with what her mother was doing, that would take longer, would require the passage of time, and the delivery of the goats and the grain, and the witness document would require seeing Marcus stand before the community and say the words. But she was watching Agnes with a quality of attention that was close to understanding, not of the specific decision, but of the person making it, of the distinction between the woman her mother actually was and the diminished version of that woman that Marcus's October calculation had attempted to install in everyone's perception. Marcus stood in the snow outside Agnes's camp and looked at her and looked at the smokehouse door and looked back at her. He was a silhouette against the white landscape, his breath coming in slow, visible clouds, the ice still present in his beard, his shoulders carrying the load of 6 weeks of being wrong in a way that had consequences for other people. The snow continued to fall in the light, purposeful way it falls when it intends to accumulate, and each flake that landed on his coat and shoulders was an additional small weight added to what he was already carrying. I agree. His voice had reduced itself to its fundamental components, stripped of the dry authority that had been its habitual register, arriving now at something closer to the plain sound a human voice makes when the performance has been exhausted and only the person is left. Agnes heard it and recognized it as genuine, which was the only form of the agreement she would have accepted. She had not needed him to be destroyed. She had needed him to be honest, which was harder. She sent Helen for 2 portions of the smoked venison, which Helen provided with the compressed efficiency of a person acting against her preferences in service of a decision she had decided to support. Agnes wrapped both portions in cloth and handed them to Marcus without ceremony. He looked at them in his hands for a moment before placing them inside his coat with the careful attention of someone handling things they have not earned. He left within the hour, retracing his path south along the frozen creek, his figure diminishing into the gray-white of the afternoon until the bend in the creek took him, and he was gone. The 4 of them stood in the camp and watched the space where he had been, and the snow continued to fall, and the smokehouse sat in the hillside and did what it had been built to do, and for a long time no one said anything, because the situation did not require words, and there were none available that would add to what the situation had already said for itself. Winter deepened through December and into January with the deliberate, irreversible authority of a geological process. The creek froze completely by the solstice, the ice thickening from the edges inward, until even the center current was locked under a surface that Finn had tested methodically and declared safe to cross. The snow accumulated in stages rather than all at once, each storm adding to the base the previous one had established, building the landscape upward from its autumn configuration until the usual references were buried, and the country looked like a different place than it had in October. Agnes maintained the routines. Trap lines cleared every morning before full light. Smokehouse fire tended through the afternoon of every second day. The water hole kept open with daily effort against the ice that was continuously trying to reclaim it. These routines were not burdensome. They were the mechanism by which the system stayed operational, and Agnes understood them in that register as maintenance rather than labor, the price of continued function. A second trapper came through in December, a younger man named Garrett, who had heard Ben's account somewhere along his own circuit and had made a specific detour to the north-facing hill to see the thing for himself. He was more guarded than Ben had been, more professionally skeptical, the kind of man who understood that stories improved in the telling and discounted everything he had been told by approximately 40% as a starting position. Agnes showed him the smokehouse without preamble, opened the door, let him look, let him smell, let him take the same slow path of visual reasoning from the chamber to the tunnel entrance to the fire pit and back. She watched the professional skepticism encounter the physical evidence and go through the same defeat it always suffers when the evidence is undeniable. He stayed one night, traded 3 pounds of salt and a coil of good rope for a portion of the cured venison, and left in the morning having said very little but having seen everything. Agnes knew that what he had seen would travel. That was what she had intended. January produced the second significant hunt, a large doe taken by a deadfall trap Agnes had constructed at a higher elevation specifically to intercept the deer that had moved upslope ahead of the deep snow. The processing and curing cycle proceeded with the efficiency of a practiced system, the steps moving from slaughter, through butchering, through salting, through hanging in the smokehouse with the smooth inevitability of a process that has been done correctly enough times that the sequence is automatic. Helen managed the later stages of this cycle largely on her own, which Agnes noted without comment. It was the correct thing to happen, the knowledge transferring from the person who had originated it to the person who would need to operate independently in the future. February arrived with a brief, deceptive warm stretch in its second week that produced 4 days of above freezing temperatures and a quality of light that the children responded to with an alertness that Agnes recognized as the body's accurate reading of seasonal change before the mind had processed the evidence. The warmth did not last. February made its usual concession to winter's final argument in its third week, with a storm that left the camp under 2 feet of new accumulation that Agnes and Helen moved from critical areas over the course of a full day's work. But the warm stretch had been real, and it meant that the calendar was moving in the direction they needed it to move, and that the supplied calculations Agnes had been running daily were going to produce a functional margin rather than a deficit. They had enough. Not more than enough. The system had not been designed for abundance, had been designed for sufficiency, and sufficiency was what it produced. By the first week of March, when the south-facing slopes began to show ground again, through the retreating snow and the creek found its voice under the thinning ice, and the mornings began to arrive at a temperature that felt like possibility rather than threat. Agnes's calculations showed adequate supply for the remaining cold weeks, with a surplus she had not expected. She assessed it with satisfaction. Then, with something more forward-looking, the surplus was not just food. It was the foundation of the next transaction. Spring did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way Agnes's smokehouse worked, gradually through processes that operated below the visible surface, changing the internal conditions before the external evidence became apparent. The creek ran clear under ice that was growing more translucent each day. The deer came back down from the upper slopes. The birds that had been absent returned with the reliable punctuality of creatures operating on a schedule that did not require human observation to maintain. Agnes watched all of it with the attention she gave to everything important, not with sentiment, but with the practical interest of a person already planning the next season. Marcus came on the 4th day of April, when the mud had dried sufficiently for the wagon to make the creek crossing. He came with 2 other men from the settlement, which was the minimum required to serve as witnesses, and with a document written out in full in the formal language of property transfer. He came with the 10 bags of grain loaded in the wagon bed. He came 2 days later by a separate arrangement with the goats Inanni and her nearly grown kid, both in good condition. Both bred their milk production beginning within the week. The tool delivery required a 3rd trip and produced a moment Agnes had not anticipated, and that affected her more than she would have predicted. The ads she recognized, first her husband Thomas's ads, the balance of it so specific to his preference that she had always thought of it as an extension of his body rather than a separate object. She held it and felt the worn hickory of the handle, and did not permit herself to stay in that feeling for more than a moment, because the moment contained 2 barn and she had work to do, and the ads needed to be used rather than mourned, and Thomas would have agreed with this assessment completely. The public accounting that Marcus made before the settlement was a quiet event, as Agnes had known it would be. There was no drama in it, no crowd in the street, no theatrical performance of guilt. Marcus stood at the front of the community's meeting house on a Tuesday morning in April, with approximately 30 people present, and said in the voice of a man who has done the work of arriving at honesty, even when the path has been entirely uphill, that he had made a decision in October that had been wrong. That he had cast out Agnes and her family based on a judgment about their worth that the subsequent winter had comprehensively disproved. That he was prepared to say so directly and without qualification in front of anyone who needed to hear it. He said Agnes's name clearly. He said Helen's name. He said Clara's and Finn's names. He used the word wrong. He did not embellish, did not soften, did not provide the contextualizing qualifications that would have made the statement more comfortable for himself and less useful for everyone else. Agnes had not been present and had not planned to be present. She heard the account of it from a woman named Ruth, who came to the homestead 2 days later carrying a basket of early spring greens in the story. Agnes listened and nodded once and asked about the greens, and Ruth, who had been a neighbor for 20 years and had looked away in the general store the previous autumn and had been carrying the weight of that particular failure ever since, understood from Agnes's response that the public accounting had been received exactly as it had been intended, as a transaction completed, a contract honored, a debt settled in the only currency that had been asked for. The families began coming in the weeks after. Not all at once and not from any organized impulse, but in the way people come to things they need that have also been made available tentatively at first, then with increasing directness as the earlier visitors returned and reported what they had found. They came to trade. But they came also and increasingly to look at the smokehouse, to understand how it worked, to ask Agnes questions that she answered with the same systematic patience she applied to everything she did. She taught them not as a teacher teaches students, not from a position of bestowed knowledge, flowing downward from authority to dependence, but in the way that one competent person shows another competent person something useful with mutual respect as the baseline assumption and practical application as the only relevant standard. She explained the cold smoke principle. She explained why the north face mattered and how to read a slope for the right thermal properties. She explained the grade of the flue and why the distance mattered and how to select the stones for lining. She explained the wood selection and the green materials supplement and the ventilation gap sizing. She explained it completely, holding nothing back because the knowledge was not her property in any sense that required protection. It was her contribution, the thing she had to offer in return for the community she was choosing carefully and on her own terms to rejoin. The first family to build their own smokehouse on Agnes's design was the Aldrich household. Their construction took 3 weeks and proceeded with Agnes consulting twice on structural questions, both times providing specific answers and then stepping back to let the builders apply the answers in their own way. The result was not identical to Agnes's original. No copy of a good design ever is, but it was functionally sound, and when they fired it the first time, and the smoke behaved as it was supposed to behave, and the meat came out of the first curing cycle with the quality Agnes had described, she felt something that she identified precisely, not pride in the reproduction, but satisfaction in the transmission. The knowledge had moved from her mind into another mind, and from that mind into a physical structure, and from that structure into the community's capacity for winter survival. It was irreversible in the best possible sense. By midsummer, there were 4 smokehouse operations on the Agnes design in the hills around the settlement, each one slightly different in its specifics, each one adapted to the particular hillside and available materials and family requirements that had shaped it. A 5th was under construction. The principle was spreading not through instruction, but through demonstrated effectiveness, which was the only propagation mechanism that Agnes had ever trusted, the spread of an idea that proves itself. She was sitting outside one evening in late June. They had built a proper cabin by then, modest but adequate, using the skills and tools that the winter had provided and the spring had delivered, watching Clara and Finn moving along the creek bank in the long evening light. Clara was checking a set of snares she had designed and placed herself, working from Agnes's methodology, but with adjustments of her own devising that Agnes had observed and not commented on because they were good adjustments, more sensitive to the specific behavior of the rabbit population in that section of the creek than Agnes's original placements had been. Finn was at the water's edge studying something. Water behavior had become his territory, and he was currently building a working theory about the relationship between the depth of the current and the distribution of the trout population that Agnes found when he explained it to her both accurate and original. She watched them in the long summer light and understood with a particular clarity that arrives sometimes in moments of stillness what the winter had actually produced. Not the smokehouse, which was a method and would spread as methods spread. Not the establishment of the homestead, which was a fact and would persist as facts persist. The winter had produced these 2 children who were becoming people shaped by a curriculum that no community structure had designed, that had been written entirely by necessity and executed entirely through the application of honest attention to the actual world. They had learned that the land was readable, that the physical world operated according to consistent principles that could be understood and used, that the gap between an obstacle and a solution was almost always narrower than it appeared from the outside. Helen came and sat beside her close enough that their shoulders were touching in the way of 2 people who have been through the same thing and no longer require the usual distance that people maintain who have not. The evening was one of the particular long evenings of early summer in the hills, the light golden and horizontal, and seemingly inexhaustible, the creek running quietly over its stones, the air carrying the smell of the pine, and the new growth and the specific clean quality of high country that Agnes had not, she realized, fully noticed until this moment, because she had been too busy doing the thing that had made it possible to sit here and notice it. Helen's voice, when it came, was settled and durable and entirely her own. Do you think we would have built any of this if he hadn't thrown us out? Agnes considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, turning it over, examining its actual content rather than its surface. She was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "We would have built other things, better things in some ways, easier things, but not this." She looked at the smokehouse door in the hillside, still in use, stocked for the coming winter. Already its pine planks weathered to gray in the months since she had split them from the fallen tree. Some things can only be built from where you have no choice. The necessity is part of the architecture. Helen sat with this. Then, he gave us a terrible gift. Agnes looked at her daughter, at the woman that the winter had extended and clarified and returned in some essential way to the most accurate version of herself. He gave us nothing. Agnes said, her voice carrying the flat, definitive quality of a correction that is also a declaration. We built everything here ourselves. He only showed us where the hill was. Above them, in the last warmth of the evening, the thin line of smoke from the smokehouse's maintenance fire drifted upward from the ventilation gaps and dissolved into the deepening blue of the summer sky. A signal that meant something different now than it had meant in November. Not survival's fragile advertisement, but a permanent fixture of this hillside, a feature as natural and as constant as the creek below and the pine above and the cold north face of the earth that held the cold and made the whole system possible. Clara called something from the creek bank. She had found what she was looking for in the snare, her voice carrying the clean satisfaction of a correct prediction confirmed. Finn answered her without looking up from the water, which was his current subject and would keep him occupied until full dark. Agnes stood up from her seat outside the cabin door and stretched the familiar ache from her lower back and looked at the hill and the creek and the tree line and the sky and the children in the long light. Everything worth having on this hillside had begun with a single word spoken in the dark over a dying fire on a night when the only available evidence suggested that nothing worth having was possible. The word had been right. She had been right to hold it. She intended to hold it for however many winters remained.